The piece that I'm going to be presenting today comes out of a much longer piece. So if there are questions about terms and concepts that you want to have me elaborate on in the Q&A, we can address that then. So my key term for today is Aporia. Right. In Lose Your Mother, Saidiya Hartman voices a host of anxieties about the legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. Reflecting on her travel to the Gold Coast during the 1990s, she underscores that the Ghanaians addressed this history in especially fraught terms. Under the stewardship of Shell Oil, USAID, and a consortium of American universities, she contends as slave route tourism has become key in Ghana's desperate measure to generate needed revenue and develop a viable economy. This unseemly alliance among corporations, universities, and nonprofits ushers in a commodified version of the slave past that proves as fungible as the bodies of the long-forgotten captives. Equally troublesome in her estimation is the social function that this commodified representation of bondage serves for its primary consumers, Black American tourists. As they return to Africa in search of their heritage, the Ghanaian tours offer them door of no return rituals, reenactments of captivity, certificates of pilgrimage, and African naming ceremonies as means to reunite the African family. These market-based rituals draw parasitically on a rhetoric of familial belonging that in 20th century strains of Pan-Africanism reinforced anti-colonial and popular mobilization movements. Divorced from this more practical politics, the evocation of a romantic return curbed all discussions of African slavery and its entailments, class exploitation, gender inequality, ethnic clashes, and regional conflicts. Hartman's forceful critique thus draws its ethical force from setting touristic commercial interests in binary opposition to a history in truth defined by material struggle and conflict. Her trepidation about the market's degrading effects on the representation of the past also carries over significantly in her casting of Black American intellectuals working in the Gold Coast. When she first arrives in Ghana, her friend John, a Black expatriate and intellectual, voices skepticism about the motives of academics who abandoned the dream of Pan-African political solidarity, only to be rewarded with university chairs, fat salaries, and celebrity. The prospect of a diasporic political alliance degenerates from exposure to a corrosive market economy. Tellingly, Hartman does not offer a defense of her fellow researchers, but rather accedes to John's assertion that he knew exactly how full of shit they were. In point of fact, John's indictment prompts Hartman to reflect on her own potential complicity in such self-interest. Would I turn out to be no better than the rest of them? She muses. In dialogue with John, then, Hartman expresses her skepticism about the capacity of research to provide anything beyond surfeits of financial and cultural capital. Though Hartman gestures towards her own implication in this economy, she broaches the subject only to maintain with greater vigor the distinctions between her own agenda and such dubious trade. Whereas touristic representation of history demands an evasion of class conflict, Hartman anchors her consideration of transatlantic slavery in the Marxist scholarship of historians like Walter Rodney and Eric Williams. She draws particular inspiration from Rodney's insistence that class division among Africans was a prime engine of the slave trade. There was in existence, according to Rodney, a fundamental class contradiction between the ruling nobility and the commoners, and the ruling classes joined hands with the Europeans in exploiting the African masses. By linking herself to this tradition, Hartman defines her intellectual labor as coextensive with a materialism that she elevates above the vulgar interests of the liberal academy and the marketplace. Yet in framing her intellectual project as anti-capitalist, Hartman necessarily asks readers to misrecognize her position within these same social relations. As a member of an international research seminar sponsored by the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, an enterprise funded by the Ford Foundation, Hartman's work intersects with the institutional and economic interest that she decries. Despite her professed dedication to materialism, she never reflects fully on her own complex social position within the very market values and liberal institutions that she takes exception to throughout the narrative. I evoke the contradictory strains of Hartman's text because they index a broader set of aporias within Black diasporic theory and literary expression produced from the 1980s until now. Her thinking on this front is evocative of Jacques Derrida's insistence that aporetic impasses develop as an outgrowth of conceptual binaries in which the terms imagined as oppositional are conceived as divided absolutely by a door, a threshold, a border, a line, or simply the edge or the approach of the other as such. Notwithstanding Hartman's assertion of such borders, her formulation of a resistant materialism only draws our attention to the porosity between the politics she asserts and the spheres of commerce and institutionalization that she disavows. Or to evoke Derrida again, this impasse or aporia stems from the fact that, in truth, there is no limit. There is not yet, or there is no longer a border to cross, no opposition between two sides. The limit is too porous, permeable, and indeterminate. Hartman's aporetic thought evolves out of the labor to articulate definitive boundaries between her methods and the very material forces that constitute her social position as an academic and a Western traveler. These impediments have implications that at once extend backwards to the institutionalization of Black diasporic theory that began in the 1980s and forward through the consistent flourishing of Black literary expression that imagines Black experience in transatlantic terms. Foundational diasporic theories, including Paul Gilroy, Brent Edwards, and Henry Louis Gates, have reinforced aporetic tendencies that follow from the uneven interplay between their commitment to oppositional political ideologies, their jockeying for legitimacy within liberal academic institutions, and the forms of capitalist economic value that bind all of these social relations in totality. The same aporias that have bedeviled many theories of Black internationalism have powerfully affected the writing of diasporic literary artists. The work of authors like John Edgar Wideman, Reginald McKnight, and Susan Laurie Parks proves especially vital in tracking out the inevitable limitations of internationalist theoretical paradigms generated in the contemporary academy. Through their representations of Black American characters under the sway of contemporary diasporic theory, these writers produce a distinctive strain of reflexive literary expression. Only by reading this literature in its historical relation to such paradigms as creolization, diaspora, and the Black Atlantic can we begin to understand the historical character of literary and theoretical internationalism in this period. As I've suggested, Hartman's strategies for distinguishing her intellectual labor resonate powerfully with related evasiveness in the field of Black internationalist cultural theory. Since this subfield is, of course, too capacious to address in any way that might be understood as comprehensive in this forum, I want to focus my attention provisionally on the work of Paul Gilroy. As much as any other single theorist, Gilroy has been spectacularly visible in legitimating a strain of diasporic theory that defines its political and cultural ends in anti-capitalist terms. At the same time, this project of legitimization has also redirected the priorities of Black internationalism away from the traditions of Pan-Africanist popular mobilization towards struggles for cultural capital among the fields of African American studies, Black British cultural studies, and critical theory. The contradictions that surface between the ideology of anti-capitalism and the pursuit of institutional legitimation prove essential to the aphoretic impasses in the work of Gilroy and others. Like Hartman, Gilroy articulates his theoretical approach to diasporic cultural as oppositional with respect to capitalist forms of value. In There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack, he insists that diasporic expressive cultures in England display their anti-capitalist character both through their overtly political content and through the social relations in which they are produced and consumed. Along these same lines, he draws a sharp distinction between direct social commentary by musical performers who challenge the norms of capitalist labor relations and the means that these performers employ to retool expression's relationship to the reigning modes of consumerism. These registers of engagement in tandem amount to a mode of political utopianism in that they generate demands that cannot be contained within the structures of the existing British political system. To further establish the anti-capitalist character of Black diasporic culture, Gilroy prioritizes the rituals and practices that these artists employ to distinguish their expression from the dominant forms of consumption. Central to this argument are the sound systems, or mobile discos, that were imported into British culture by former colonial subjects that hail from Jamaica. According to Gilroy, these mobile trucks, which contain DJs, MCs, and elaborate sound systems, became a primary mechanism for the recirculation of Black Caribbean and US-inflected music throughout the British diaspora. Even though these mobile performances depended on records as a primary device for the circulation of this expressive form, Gilroy attributes a strong anti-capitalist character to the performative culture forged through these commodities. He says here, perhaps the most important effect of the sound system on the contemporary musical culture of Black Britain is revealed in the way that it is centered not on live performances by musicians and singers, though these are certainly appreciated, but on records. Public performance of recorded music is primary in both reggae and soul variants of the culture. In both, records become raw material for spontaneous performances of cultural creation in which the DJ and the MC or toaster who introduces each disc or sequence of discs emerge as the principal agent in dialogic rituals of active and celebratory consumption. It is above all in these performances that Black Britain has expressed the improvisation, spontaneity, and intimacy, which are key characteristics of all New World Black musics, providing a living bridge between them and African traditions of music making, which dissolve the distinctions between art and life, artifact and expression, which typify the contrasting traditions of Europe. Borrowing liberally from Dick Hebdige's theory of subcultures that re-signify aspects of a dominant culture, Gilroy assigns a potent resistive character to mobile sound system performances. Through the improvisational and spontaneous dimensions of live performance, these artists usher in an alternative public sphere that at once opposes the strict binaries of European tradition and redirects the social function of consumption. The DJs and MCs in this mobile culture play especially crucial roles in forging the public sphere that reconfigures the record's social function through their use of scratching, sampling, reversing, and other material manipulation of records. These figures have developed an approach in which records are not simply played and heard. Taking the record as raw material for the performance, consumption is turned outwards, no longer a private, passive, or individual process. It becomes a procedure of collective affirmation and protest in which a new authentic public sphere is brought into being. Through such performative interaction with the materiality of the object as such, the DJ removes the commodity from its original context to forge novel modes of diasporic communion and solidarity. Now, while the notion that these diasporic communities repurpose commodities to fashion alternative collective identities is certainly provocative, it is less clear how such performances oppose capitalism in any material or politically instrumental way. In truth, the dependence on the commodity as the mediating object for the fulfillment of diasporic collectivism suggests not an opposition to market values, but a necessary interdependence with them. This entanglement, while acknowledged glancingly by Gilroy, is overshadowed in his account by an outsized commitment to the rhetoric of anti-capitalism. Gilroy insists on a theoretical elevation of Black culture's alterity, a mode of difference that is bedeviled by this culture's dependence on consumer goods. No less fraught in Gilroy's theorization of an anti-capitalist diasporic culture are the particular concepts he evokes to represent the racial distinctiveness of its traditions. His terms of art for Black Atlantic performance, spontaneity, and improvisation bear an uncanny resemblance to the historical discourses of racial difference that have shaped the reception of such expression in the capitalist marketplace. Whether in the minstrel tradition or the commercial vogue of primitivism, the spontaneous, improvisatory character of Black culture has been synonymous with its economic value for some time. It is this fetish for primal vitality that scholars like Nathan Huggins and David Levering Lewis rail against in their classic works on the Harlem Renaissance. Taking exception to the white fascination with early jazz, Huggins insists it was not merely that jazz was exotic, but that it was instinctive and abandoned. The downtown white spectator tried to encompass the looseness and freedom of dance. In this respect, Gilroy's celebration of an improvisatory and spontaneous diasporic culture does not pose a clear opposition to the forms of value that have been attributed to Black cultural production historically. Rather, through such repetition, he provides a refined theoretical rationale for profitable and familiar signs of difference. Gilroy's gravitation towards these capitalist formations of racial value ultimately gates his passage to the emancipatory anti-capitalism that he pursues. Moreover, the very fact that he arrives at this impasse as he is also pursuing the cultural capital and esteem of an emergent academic field only intensifies the aphoretic paradox. As I suggested in my initial reading of Hartman's text, her evocation of the touristic is equally key to understanding the aphoretic tendencies of key strains in recent Black internationalism. Tourism has routinely surfaced as the category of experience that contemporary theorists and literary figures evoke to throw into relief their anti-capitalist forms of Black internationalism. Hartman's impulse to construe intellectually motivated travel as an activity distinct from the market interests of tourism underlines an evasive tendency that has been probed with critical acuity in the fiction of Reginald McKnight. He initiates a robust critical anatomy of the Black professional's social relationship to internationalism in this period. In his novels, I Get on the Bus and He Sleeps, McKnight is preoccupied with diasporic travelers returning to Africa under mandates dictated by their professions, be it in their affinity for diasporic theories of cultural continuity, their deployment of traditional ethnographic tropes, or their recourse to the conventions of colonial travel writing. McKnight's Black professionals are steeped in institutional knowledge about the diaspora. These figures trade widely in the cultural and financial capital that accrues from this knowledge, even as what they know clashes with their longing for a diasporic politics that is resistant to capitalist interests. By foregrounding the troublesome consequences of these contradictions, McKnight produces a literature that is inspired by the very aporias of contemporary internationalism that he critically assesses. In his novel, He Sleeps, McKnight advances a meditation on these dynamics through Bertrand Milford, a Black American folklorist, and his two native informants, Idrissa and Omar. While Idrissa proves to be unreliable when mediating Bertrand's economic negotiations, Bertrand nonetheless casts him as an ideal assistant in other respects. Praising Idrissa's powers as a guide, Bertrand admires his extemporaneous discussions of history, economics, and myths about wherever in Senegal we happen to be. Idrissa is self-educated and garrulous, my kind of person. As a man who seems to know everything about the country, the value of Idrissa stems from his capacity to make the alien features of Senegalese culture fully transparent and legible. As anthropologists like James Clifford and Paul Rabineau maintain, such ethnographic accounts of the growing intimacy and trust between anthropologists and their informants are central tropes for legitimating authoritative knowledge about a foreign culture. Clifford famously characterizes such rhetorical devices as fables of rapport, in which the ethnographer first stages an early ignorance, misunderstanding, lack of contact, frequently a sort of childlike status within the culture at hand. Through the subsequent narration of an evolving relation of trust, intimacy, and even friendship with the informant, the ethnographer established a presumption of connectedness, which permits the writer to function in his subsequent analysis as an omnipresent, knowledgeable exegete and spokesman. Understood in these terms, Bertrand's elevation of his friendship with Idrissa is a constitutive feature of his professional pursuit of authoritative knowledge about Senegalese culture. The very recourse to friendship in Bertrand's depiction of Idrissa is therefore a euphemized form of cultural capital that reinforces the authority of the anthropologist. McKnight troubles Bertrand's relationship to this ethnographic ideal through the representation of Omar, a second native informant who substitutes for Idrissa when the latter cannot accompany Bertrand during his fieldwork. Omar possesses no competency in this regard. A tailor by trade, his poor English makes him a translator whose ability to mediate on Bertrand's behalf is suspect at best. Ultimately, Omar is less interested in providing Bertrand with cultural knowledge about Senegal than he is in the material benefits of their relationship. As Bertrand laments, he perpetually thrusts his long hands at me for cigarettes, money favors. Moreover, while these financial interests certainly frustrate Bertrand, he finds Omar's particular modes of self-fashioning even more grating. A self-styled Rastafarian, Omar has pieced together a diasporic identity from Peter Tosh couplets and snippets of Jamaican vernacular, such as his pet phrase, I and I, man. A key part of what appalls Bertrand about Omar, then, is this depthless appropriation of Jamaican culture through consumption. Because Omar knows so little about the New World, he has the notion that since the US and Jamaica are geographically close, Jamaicans and Black Americans are interchangeable. I'm pretty certain I'm of more value to him as a faux Jamaican than as a genuine American. Through a rhetoric of comic exaggeration, Bertrand evokes Omar's ignorance and delegitimates this modality of market-based self-fashioning. Being such a vulgar product of a global capitalist marketplace depreciates Omar's value as a conduit for institutionalized cultural capital. This declension, in turn, only further underscores the pride of place that Idrissa holds for Bertrand. McKnight dismantles such binary logic with verve. The very concept of anthropological authority comes under critical scrutiny in an episode in which Omar guides Bertrand in his pursuit of palm wine. Having read Amos Tutuola's classic novel, Palm Wine Drinker, Bertrand is convinced that consuming this drink will bring him into closer contact with an authentic Senegalese culture. He is so seduced by this possibility that when the pair departs on the quest, Bertrand decides to leave behind the concerns of the ethnographer. Pad, pencils, and tape recorder, as well as the pithy sayings and made-up stories, become inconsequential when stuff like this happens. While Bertrand claims that he is leaving his concerns with anthropology behind, his quest for a deeper and more genuine connection to the native culture is an essential feature of ethnographic discourse. The satirical impulse of this episode evolves partly from the unseemly resemblance between Bertrand's fetishization of palm wine as a synecdoche for authenticity and equally fragmented acquisition of Jamaican culture by Omar. In his Genealogy of Modern Ethnography, Clifford indicates that in the predominantly synecdochic rhetorical stance of the new ethnography, parts of a given culture were assumed to be microcosms or analogies of wholes. One implication of this equivalence is that the strategies of legitimation employed by the anthropologist constitute an ideology that is every bit as fragmented and abstracted as Omar's consumption. In underscoring such resemblances, McKnight formalizes his inclination not only to dissolve the strict opposition between the authoritative anthropologist and his flawed native informant, but that between Omar and Idrissa. The political salience of Bertrand's standing among the Senegalese comes under fuller critical scrutiny during their search for palm wine. While Bertrand reveals to a group of Senegalese men that he is in the country to study contemporary vernacular stories, he is taken aback by their skeptical response to his work. In offering a warrant for his research, Bertrand claims, "I'm trying to help all Black people recovering our forgotten things." In this formulation, he reframes the labor of the professional anthropologist as a preservation of cultural tradition on behalf of a diasporic community. Despite this magnanimous casting of his research, the group of locals remains doubtful about the enterprise. A local man named Dudu accuses Bertrand of reproducing a long tradition in Western anthropology that treats Africans as primitive people. Another man takes offense because you write us down, you don't respect us, you come here and steal from us. Whether in linking Bertrand to a legacy of primitivist objectification or casting his recordings of Senegalese culture as a means to abscond with the nation's cultural capital, the men duly insist on positioning Bertrand within the professional ideologies and economic priorities of the Western Academy. Their well-founded rebuttals make it virtually impossible for Bertrand to sustain his aphoretic commitment to both diasporic solidarity and the forms of capital conferred by his profession. The ethical force of the scene follows from McKnight's efforts to make the gaps and aporias of Bertrand's assertions into a fully legible presence within the narrative. By reading McKnight's satirical treatment of the aporetic in relation to the unexamined impasses in key strains of Black diasporic theory, I'm making the case for a stronger commitment to reassessing the economic and institutional protocols that have consequentially shaped the turn towards Black internationalism. Because this field has not been sufficiently attentive to the centrality of both market forms of value and the institutional imperatives of the liberal academy, the intellectual commitment to forms of resistance, including anti-capitalism, transnational solidarity, and oppositional expressive culture, has been routinized without adequate critical reflection. Literary artists like McKnight, John Edgar Wideman, and Susan Laurie Parks illuminate these limitations in ways that press critics to develop interpretive frameworks that move through and against the impasses of an era. All right, thank you for listening.